Lesson 49, separating code and data. Well, one of the best practices is that we want to keep our data separate from the programming code. You do need a minimal amount of code in the data workbook that will go out and open the macro workbook. This basically is borrowing a concept that many Access programmers use. Let's get started. All right, well, here's a little bit of a story about something that happened to a VBA programmer. They developed, several different reports for a client. Let's say that there were maybe a few hundred to 1,000 lines of code, several different reports, and they did some testing and thought that it was ready to go. So they delivered it to the client. The client took that one workbook and distributed it to their 50 sales reps. And a couple of days later, it was discovered that there was a bug in the code. There was something wrong in the code. And so now we had a problem because the workbook had been sent out to the 50 sales reps, and the 50 sales reps had all been using it. They had been entering their data in the workbook. And we discovered the changes to the code had to happen in 50 different workbooks, which were now spread across the country. It was just an absolute disaster. Now, I inherited that client later and saw this problem and said, we have to have a better way to go. And so I came up with a concept that the people who use Access have been using for a long, long time. In Access, you have one database that's the data database and another database that's where all of the forms and things like that are. And so I came up with the same concept here, where we'll have a data workbook and the people can update their data. And my goal was to have as little code as possible in the data workbook. Let's go take a look at the code that's in the data workbook. So here's the data workbook here. You'll see there are no modules at all. We're going to go into this workbook, and we have two macros here, one called workbook open and another one workbook before close. So in workbook open, we go check and see if the code workbook is open. Hey, look for workbook's code xlsm.name, and then it checks the error.number. If that error number is not equal to 0, if it's not open, then we go out and do workbooks.open, file name, code file. And then the real important part is this workbook.open runs one line of code in the code workbook, something called cust file open. And you can call this whatever you'd like. Cust file open. Now, even if cust file open is empty, if there's nothing in it, always have a hook in this workbook open that runs this macro. We discovered, like a few months in, that we needed to make some changes programmatically to the data file. We had to add a new worksheet or something like that. Well, we were able to tuck those into cust file open. Hey, check and see if this new worksheet's there. If it's not, go ahead and add it. And so that cust file open, was a great utility to have, to know that every time we opened the data workbook, we were going to run that macro, even if initially the macro was empty. And then when they click close, now typically when you click close, this before close macro runs, and then it says, hey, do you want to save the workbook? So we want to make sure to set workbook.saved equals true. So I had to ask, hey, if workbook.saved is false, I pop up a message, would you like to save the changes? If they say yes, then I save it. If they say no, I go ahead and mark it as saved, so that way they don't get the question. And then right before we close the code workbook, I run cust file close. All right, so let's see, what do we have here? We have, it looks like 51 lines of code, and these 51 lines of code are bulletproof. They've been used for years for me, and I know that I'm never going to have to change these 51 lines of code. So this is the only code that's in the data workbook. We sent this out to the 50 sales reps, and they started using it. And at the same time, we also sent them the code XLSM. Let's take a look at that workbook. Code XLSM is basically an empty workbook, hardly any sheets at all. We're actually going to hide this workbook. In Code XLSM, we have all of the thousands of lines of code that do the work. Now, I'm not giving you thousands of lines of code, but the point is you would put your thousands of lines of code here. Two macros you have to have: cust file open, cust file close. These can be empty initially, but trust me, you will appreciate the data that are there if you need to make some changes to the customer file. And then the modification basically is if you have thousands of lines of code that are referring to this workbook, well, you need to change that to have them work on the active workbook. Now, the last thing I want to do is I want to hide the code workbook so no one even knows that it's open. Here's how we do that. We go back into Excel, into Code XLSM. We go to the View tab and we click Hide. Okay, so now it looks like it's not even a window. It's not something I can switch to. We've hidden the workbook. The one bit of hassle now is that we have to save Code XLSM in the hidden form. So in VBA, we can click on Code XLSM and click Save. That will allow us to save Code XLSM. We could even then close it here, workbooks code.xlsm.close, and we know that it is now saved and closed. So we're good to go. All right. So the two workbook system is a great way to go. You know, that way you can distribute the code workbook and you never have to worry about replacing the data workbook. People can keep their own data. You don't have to go visit 50 different sites and update any code there. You just have a tiny bit of code that you know is going to work, and it always calls the code workbook. Of course, we can send out the code workbook every single day and tell people to replace their code workbook with this new workbook. It's worked great. I've used this for hundreds of clients over the years, and just a very efficient way to make sure that we can always update the code without having to touch the people's data. Well, I hope you found this lesson helpful. In the next lesson, we're going to wrap up talking about how to clean up recorded code.
Looking to advance your career by acquiring new skills? Tired of expensive off-site training programs? Wish you could learn from the best instructors in the industry? Look no further than Live Lessons. Self-paced, personal video instruction by the world's leading technology publishers. Each live lesson comes with a DVD featuring 3 to 4 hours of instructor-led classroom training, sample program code that allows you to work along with your personal instructor, and an example-rich study guide. Live lessons allow you to watch the entire course from start to finish, or navigate directly to any of the individual lessons. You'll literally watch over the shoulder of your instructor as he shows you how to build state-of-the-art applications. Live Lessons, the power of the world's leading technology experts at your fingertips. To learn more, visit mylivelessons.com today.